we wanted to start out with a definition of what you're studying: phenomenological ontology of breathing. I studied philosophy, and that was not in the curriculum.
Well, this is very much true. You won't find philosophy of breath in the curriculum of university studies. It's not a branch of philosophy that academic philosophers normally see as some kind of field of philosophy or a branch of philosophy. So this book, in a certain way, for example, one of the a great philosopher, Edward S. Casey, who wrote the wonderful blurb to the back of our book, writes that this is kind of a pioneer work, this atmospheres of breathing. And I'm so proud of I'm so happy what Professor Casey wrote about our book. And so you can't find this in the departments of philosophy. I hope in the future there is a possibility to take courses on philosophy of breath or even phenomenological ontology of breathing. But you asked what is phenomenological ontology of breathing that my PhD is on.
Yes. So can we start actually with the word ontology, because that one I'm a little more familiar with, and then we'll get into the phenomenological.
Yeah. That's where I was going to start.
Okay, good.
So, ontology means science or thinking of being. Thinking of that which is the most fundamental ways of being, and where perhaps we could say that everything is fundamentally based on. What is there? What is existence? What is being? These are fundamental questions of ontology. So then what happens with phenomenological ontology? Phenomenology is that field of philosophy, or the branch of philosophy, or style of making philosophy, way of thinking in philosophy that I come from, which is my philosophical background is in this phenomenological philosophy. And phenomenology means to get back into phenomena, to get back into that how things and the world appear as phenomena to us within our own experience, how we experience the world, how we live the world, how we are connected to the world, how our existential and this experiential field of the world opens to us in our own experience before we learn how for example, the sciences describe the world or explain the world. So in phenomenology, we try to get back, to return to that fundamental way of appearing, to that fundamental phenomenological way of how we experience the world before, for example, how the sciences explain the world. And so that then phenomenological ontology of breathing means that how we can say that how we are experiencing the questions of being, how they appear, what is being, before we would start to explain things and the world through conceptual frameworks and theories of science, or through some kind of belief systems and so on.
So I kind of studied the next step. I was a cognitive philosopher, and I studied, all of that framework that we put on from, sort of that mental framework that we put on the world that we learn, and that also may be somewhat fundamental. So it's interesting to see this like deeper level of work about, how might we experience the world prior to really shaping it. One of the things that particularly interests me about the work with breath is that as a yoga person, that I've heard so many kind of stories about why we tune into the breath, but you're the first person that has ever said maybe all of that isn't true, and that, or not to say it's not true, one way of looking at it, but that there's something more fundamental about breath. There's an elemental nature to the experience of breathing, to the experience of being in air. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, especially for people who weren't, on the previous call, to learn a little bit about, what you're exploring about the relationship of that we have to breath in a very basic level before we even conceive of those experiences.
Okay, I will tell and I will speak about that. But first, I will comment on when you say that you were yourself studying philosophy, kind of in the another level or next level when you were dealing with questions of cognitive science and cognitive. So cognitive science, for example, often starts with scientific point of view in the sense that they are studying what happens in our brains, for example, during the act of knowing, or in our how the brain processes are connected to our knowledge and how we perceive the world, and so on. So
absolutely, that is exactly what it is. So it's I don't want to get like too into this very academic rabbit hole, because I want to make it where people can hear it. But yes, it is exactly about, how could we describe how our brains work, how we think about the world. So anyway, yes, and it is a kind of a very scientific hand in hand with science and computer science.
Yeah. So why I want to comment on this, because this is also one way of telling how phenomenological perspective radically differs from this kind of cognitive scientific perspective. Because if you ask from the cognitive scientists, or at least many of them, how to study the mind, for example, or our mindful connection to the world, for example, a good example of this is like nowadays it is very common in contemplative sciences or this kind of scientific studies that study mindfulness meditation and this kind of spiritual practices, is that they study then the brains, what happens in the brains during mindfulness practice, or following your breath, or when you are doing certain kind of spiritual or contemplative practice. So this is so different from phenomenology, because phenomenologically, that is experientially, nobody has really experienced ever brains. We experience our head, we experience all kinds of stuff around us and what we feel when things, but we don't experience brains. Nobody knows that we have true experientially brains. We have thoughts, we have all kinds of meanings, but we don't have brains. That's all comes from science.
What I studied was almost the exact opposite of what you studied, and that it was literally the study of the things that we cannot access phenomenologically, the processes that our brains and our minds are using, that we have that sort of black box of the brain that does things that we have no experience of. So you're like the complete opposite end, where you're saying, no, let's not look at the science. Let's not look at the neural networks. Let's not look at the heartbeat, none of which we can really experience. What do we actually experience in our sight and our taste and our touch of air? And so what do you conceive of it? Like, what are your ideas about that?
So when you do what the in phenomenological philosophy, the method is called phenomenological epoche. And epoche is a Greek word which means suspension or cessation, or putting place in abeyance, or putting aside or out of play. So in phenomenology, that you can do phenomenological philosophy, this means that you have to put aside, or kind of like put in brackets, or kind of away for a moment all the scientific knowledge and all the scientific theories that we have, and then see how the world appears after that what we can truly experience without the scientific method. And it doesn't say that there is something wrong about science. Of course there is. Science has given us so much good things and interesting research results and so on. But if we straight away go to the sciences, we miss a lot of things, because in natural sciences, then the only interesting questions are those that we can find through the scientific method or through the natural scientific concepts and their way of thinking. For example, all the questions of like what we truly experience, which is then the most important thing in spiritual life and meditation, is straight away put aside, because that's what then cognitive science tells about, for example, mindfulness meditation and what happens in our brains. For example, they say that the certain kind of brain waves change and so on, but we don't experience any of that. We experience some kind of, for example, relaxment and stuff like that.
That's what I think is so fascinating about what you're doing, how relevant it is to the work that we do in yoga, because it's funny to me, you know, it's funny now that I talk with you, although I never considered it, that we have all of these explanations that come from medicine and science about, you know, the benefits of mindfulness and of, you know, meditation, of yoga. But yoga fundamentally is a phenomenological practice. It's actually moving out of that, you know, getting out of your head. And so to me, it's like amazing to me that there is the study of what we might actually be trying to put into words, what we're actually experiencing at that level.
Exactly. This is the key point, Susanna. This is great, because yoga and meditation are phenomenological in their origin, experiential. And it's important to remember that, for example, the writer of Yoga Sutras, Patanjali, he didn't know anything about cognitive sciences. Buddha, who invented these mindfulness methods, or at least he developed them through Upanishadic tradition, he didn't know anything about cognitive science. Neither did any of the writers of Upanishads who were talking about meditation already a few thousand years ago. They didn't know anything about cognitive science. So the origin of these practices is somewhere completely different than what our science then now studies. And so this is very important. But then if we go to this, your question of like, what do I actually then do, or how do I then see the breath, is that how the breath can become a tool for meditative or spiritual practice. So many of the traditions use it as a certain kind of method or a tool or practice for spiritual development, for relaxation, or for searching God, or searching nirvana, or trying to find one's Atman, or whatever is the way that we conceptualize the goal, what we are doing, is that before we can do this, there has to be the experience of breath. Because if there wouldn't have been first some kind of experience of breath, none of these spiritual masters would have ever invented that let's use this breath. So there has to be already, before it is being used as a method or as a tool for some kind of spiritual goals or some kind of other goals, for example, anxiety releasement, which is now is used, for example, in these stress releasement methods of mindfulness. So what I do in phenomenology is then I'm very interested of the meditative practices of the Eastern philosophy, because these are, as you said, phenomenological methods of using the breath and then getting deeper into the breath and expanding the breath and controlling the breath and so on. But before that, the experience of breath then itself has to have already something that made these people think or try to, that they wanted to then expand or control that breath, that there has to be something. And then in this phenomenological process of mine, I try to get back to that fundamental experience of breath and start to think it and experience it in as multidimensional ways as possible. How you begin if you start to think it as a certain kind of spacious experience, that it's how there is a respiratory space, how there is a certain kind of respiratory time, how there is certain kind of respiratory openness to the world. What is our respiratory or breathing relation with the world? How is our relation with other people, how it opens through the breath? What is then, if we are all the time in connection to the world and other people, and we can be in the connection in a theoretical way, or we can be in a practical way, or in a social way, or a perceptual way, or in a religious way, or in a scientific way. All these, there are these kind of relations that we are connected with the world. Then there is also this respiratory way, or this breathing way, that we are in a fundamental way connected with the reality, with the world. So what is the connection between that respiratory way and, for example, our way of vision, seeing the world, or our practical? So there, then these relations come in picture. And is there some kind of like a level of these fundamental ways of being in the world? And one of the ways that I would say is very interesting to investigate this is to see what happens when we fall asleep. When we fall asleep, we close our eyes. So we kind of withdraw from the visual world. Then we stay in one place, and we withdraw to our beds and try to be as non-moving or immobile as possible. So we withdraw from the movement towards the world. Then we also withdraw from our social life and we try to fall to sleep. We try to put all our actions of the day away from our mind, all our cultural goals and cultural enterprises and our work life and our all kinds of things that we normally value so much in our waking life. We try to put all of these aside or withdraw from them. And the only thing that we can't really withdraw, or we try not to withdraw, is from our respiratory relation with the world. And actually, one of my most important philosophers and phenomenologists for me is a French philosopher, Maurice Merleau-Ponty. He has these great descriptions of falling asleep. And he says that actually what we do is that we call sleep by imitating the breath of the sleeper. That it is the breath that we imitate it, and we make our breath slower and deeper than it is in our everyday life or in our waking life. And with that imitation of sleeping breath, little by little, when we go deeper and deeper into it, there happens this kind of miracle or this magical event that this imitation turns suddenly into a real sleep.